All right, hello everyone. We might get started. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. I am currently on the land of the Gadigal people and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which you are on and pay my respects to their elders past and present. The Matilda Centre is committed to embracing diversity, eliminating all forms of discrimination and welcome all people. So today we have Sam Lynch talking to us and I might hand straight over to her to get started.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Bree. And thanks so much everyone for coming along today. Just so you know, with how I've got myself set up right now, I actually can't see Zoom. So please feel free to turn your cameras off if that would be your preference, because I can't see you and it'll all be okay. So today I'm going to be talking about a systematic review I've done as part of my PhD on transdiagnostic risk and protective factors for general and specific psychopathology in young people. As I said, it's part of my PhD, and like most systematic reviews, it ended up being a lot bigger and a lot more challenging than what I first thought it would be, but I'm almost at the tail end of it now, and I'm really excited to share some of the results and some of the things I've learned along the way with you today. So just by way of background, the adolescent period is a really critical time for the onset of mental and substance use disorders. So roughly 50% of all disorders emerge before age 14 and around 75% by the age of 25. And as you can see from that cool bar graph on screen, the onset of different kinds of disorders sort of peaks at different times across development. Now, it's also really common for people to experience comorbid disorders, which I know won't come as a surprise to most of you. So approximately about 30% of the general population will experience 2 or more disorders, and that same rate still applies to children and adolescents. Now, comorbidity is pretty concerning because it is associated with poorer treatment outcomes, greater symptom severity, poorer physical health, and overall functioning. So these high rates of comorbidity are not only concerning because of the impact it has on individuals, but it also suggests that there might be some shared underlying risk and protective factors across disorders, and that we might be able to target these in prevention or early intervention. And thus the concept of transdiagnostic risk and protective factors was born. So these are factors or processes that operate across diagnostic boundaries to either increase or reduce mental health problems. So they can be biological, psychological, or socio-environmental in nature. And as you can see from the image on screen, something can be transdiagnostic across diagnoses within a diagnostic group. So for example, within mood disorders, or it can act across 2 or more diagnostic groups. So it can act across mood and anxiety disorders and so on and so forth. So in terms of what we already know about transdiagnostic risk and protective factors, we can look at earlier reviews. And so there's been one previous review that's looked at psychosocial risk factors in children and adolescents, and they found that there was really low levels of specificity. So that is that risk factors increased risk across multiple disorders. And indeed, to date, there's actually been not really any markers or processes that have been identified that are uniquely associated with a specific disorder. So kind of like with comorbidity, this is also kind of suggesting that there's probably some common underlying causes and that these are acting transdiagnostically. However, it also kind of suggests that maybe there's some problems with how we're currently classifying and diagnosing disorders, or how we're conceptualizing the structure of psychopathology. So traditionally, we've conceptualized psychopathology in terms of like these discrete categories, such as the ones you see in the ICD or the DSM. And these sort of like discrete categories, typically they've been formed on clinical consensus rather than empirical data. They also have really low reliability. We also see lots of heterogeneity within disorders. So 2 people with the same diagnosis can present with quite different symptoms. There's also really poor predictive validity. And again, high comorbidity. So I said 30% before in the general population, but it's actually as high as 80% in clinical or treatment-seeking populations. So all this together kind of is starting to suggest that we're sort of reaching the limitations of our existing conceptualization of psychopathology. And there's also sort of overwhelming and growing evidence to support the idea that psychopathology is dimensional in nature, and symptoms exist on a continuum with normal range functioning. And so we're now starting to see alternative conceptualizations appearing in the literature. And so I'll run you through a couple of those now. The main one that you'll see most common is this hierarchical dimensional model of psychopathology. So the image on screen is actually for a specific model. It's the hierarchical taxonomy of psychopathology, which is probably the leading example of hierarchical models at the moment. So in these models, they conceptualize psychopathology as dimensions, and so symptoms, syndromes, and spectra are continuous. It's empirically or quantitatively defined, and we see that comorbidity is represented by these higher order dimensions. So, for example, some of the most common examples are internalizing and externalizing dimensions. So internalizing is typically comprised of symptoms of depression and anxiety, whereas externalizing is typically comprised of conduct or behavior issues and substance use. And so we also often see a thought disorder dimension, which captures psychotic-like symptoms, but then there are these other sort of higher order dimensions as well, as you can see on screen. For reference, the dotted lines indicate where there's sort of missing pieces of research, and we need to do more on that to better understand those layers of the structure and where certain pieces fit in. Now you also see at the very apex of this, we have this thing called the P factor. Now this is a term for a theoretical construct. Broadly speaking, it represents what is common across all of the psychiatric sort of disorders or signs and symptoms. We don't really know what it is right now. The most likely explanation is that it's probably an index of impairment or severity of symptoms. However, there are also some other theories around it representing sort of like a shared vulnerability to all disorders, though we're not quite sure what that vulnerability, what form that actually takes. And as you can imagine, with this kind of like broad structure, it's actually really hard to collect and come by data where you have a large enough sample, and also with data on the full range of mental disorders. So in practice, in research, we usually see studies looking at sort of sections of this model, so that, for example, they might just focus on the P factor, internalizing and externalizing. It's also important to note that there's no standard or set sort of like statistical method for arriving at this kind of a model, and so we do see a lot of different sort of approaches used in the literature, but there are sort of like 2 or 3 really common or popular approaches. And so if you just like come with me for a moment on a quick stats journey, I promise I'll make it quick and painless. So first of all, there's the correlated factor model, and this is kind of like the original structural model used in child psychopathology research. So you'll normally see it with 2 or more distinct but related latent variables, and these are summarizing the shared variance among sort of their indicators or symptoms. And they account for the shared processes among the disorders within each spectrum. So the correlated factor models tend to identify at least 2 transdiagnostic spectra, particularly internalizing and externalizing, though as you can see on screen in these examples, we do also sometimes see a thought disorder. Interestingly as well, sometimes we also see that internalizing is split into fear and distress subfactors. Now, importantly, the correlation between these dimensions, particularly internalizing and externalizing, is actually fairly high. It's usually somewhere between, I think, 0.4 and 0.7, which is pretty strong. And so a lot of people were starting to wonder, well, how can we capture that correlation? How can we start to study it more? And so that's when we started to see these other models emerge, particularly the bifactor model. So in the bifactor model, every symptom kind of loads onto both a general factor and one specific factor, so like internalizing, and it partitions the total explained variance in each symptom between these uncorrelated factors. In contrast, in higher order models, symptoms load onto one of several lower order factors, and these lower order factors then load onto a second general factor. And this is defined by the variance shared by those lower order factors. So the general factor in higher order models is a little bit more removed from those individual symptoms than it would be in the bifactor model. Now, choosing between these sort of statistical models kind of depends on the research that you're wanting to do. Bifactor models are particularly popular because of those uncorrelated factors. They better enable you to sort of study shared and unique sources of association between the dimensions of psychopathology and external variables. However, there are some fairly serious concerns about the bifactor model, particularly in relation to the reliability of the specific factors. So often after the shared variance accounted for by the general factor, there's very little information left in those specific factors. And often you see this thing called factor collapse, where there's not much information left in them and the factor is just kind of a little bit useless. So these are just some examples of dimensional models of psychopathology. Now, these aren't the only sort of alternative conceptualization of psychopathology. So the other sort of growing contender are these sort of like network models or network approaches. So in the network approach, they conceptualize psychopathology in terms of individual symptoms and the associations between them. So in this framework, disorders are comprised of networks of causally related symptoms, and comorbidity is the result of some symptoms causing symptoms in other disorder networks, resulting in this sort of broad network of associations among disorders. And so what's interesting as well is that with network models, they've also been able to replicate some of the dimensions that we've seen in those dimensional models. So here's an example showing how internalizing and externalizing problems, as well as attention, thought, and social problems all fit together. And it's pretty hectic to look at, to be honest. But now that we've all know a little bit more about empirically based models of psychopathology, let's get back on track and let's have a little bit more of a talk about the review. So what we really wanted to know was what transdiagnostic risk and protective factors were associated with empirically based models of psychopathology in young people. And so we thought, I know, let's do a systematic review. And so the specific aim of our review was to identify transdiagnostic risk and protective factors for psychopathology in young people by synthesizing and critically evaluating studies examining empirically based models of psychopathology. Now, I won't go into too much detail with the methods. You can actually read the full protocol online at JMIR Research Protocols. The reference is at the bottom of the screen there for you. But just briefly, we conducted searches in Medline, Embase, and PsycInfo databases, as well as hand searching reference lists, and also just generally keeping an eye out for relevant papers. We used the PICO framework to develop our eligibility criteria. Specifically, we wanted to look at studies where the mean age of participants was between 10 and 24 years. And so this is using the World Health Organization's definition of a young person. In terms of exposure or risk, basically we were happy to look at any variable other than psychopathology. We weren't concerned whether it was biological or psychological or whatever in nature. We didn't need to specify a comparison simply because of the dimensional nature of psychopathology. And in terms of outcome, again, specifically looking at empirical models, but they needed to be comprised of at least two or more broad groups of signs or symptoms. So we needed to see a model of at least, for example, internalizing and externalizing. We also specified that the papers be written in English, had to be peer reviewed, and we excluded anything that didn't report original findings or was like a conference abstract or anything like that. We also included both longitudinal and cross-sectional studies, simply because we knew the field was quite young, and so we didn't want to exclude potentially important information that we might find from cross-sectional studies. Now, this did mean that when we did our quality assessments, we had to use 2 checklists. So we used the Joanna Briggs checklist for analytical cross-sectional studies and the checklist for cohort studies. And both the eligibility and quality were assessed by 2 independent raters. So in terms of results, so we initially started with about 2,000 papers that were screened at the title and abstract stage. Then we had 160 that went through to full text review. And after that, we were left with 41 studies with an average quality rating of 93%. And from those 41 studies, they looked at over 130 unique risk or protective factors, which is, not going to lie, pretty overwhelming. And we were also able to sort of like broadly group those factors into either biological, psychological, and socio-environmental. As you can see, there was a lot of studies that had examined biological variables, but that does include studies where they had even just reported on sex or gender differences. So their primary outcome, their primary variable might have been psychological in nature, but if they've also reported sex and gender differences, we've captured that as well. Now, of the studies, most of them were cross-sectional. However, we did have 15 longitudinal studies in there as well. Not surprisingly, more than 65% were from the US. The second leading contributor was actually Australia, and we chipped in 4 papers. And what is interesting is that, as you can probably see from that bar graph, the first paper was actually only published in 2011, so really not that long ago. And 54% of papers were published in the last 2 years alone. So it's a really young but really fast growing kind of field of research. And I really shudder to think about how many papers might have been published last year had there not been a pandemic. Like, yikes. And you can also see on the chart that we're starting to see more longitudinal research come out, which is obviously really important when studying risk and protective factors. Now, in terms of the models of psychopathology, we saw a huge range of statistical methods used. So there are actually 50 different models that were examined from the 41 studies. So this chart here is sort of showing you the sort of like proportions of the different approaches used. So overwhelmingly, factor analytic approaches were used the most, and specifically a biofactor model. This wasn't a huge surprise to us, but we did also see some other types of analysis, so class-based, growth curve analysis, principal components, and even a sneaky machine learning analysis in there. In terms of the outcome variables, so there were 25 unique combinations of outcome variables. So the most common combination was a structure comprised of a general factor of psychopathology, internalizing and externalizing. And then the next most common was a structure comprised of internalizing and externalizing. And then we also had a lot of studies that just looked at general psychopathology and didn't look at any specific factors. Importantly, there were more than 60 different measures of psychopathology used to arrive at these sort of outcome variables, and of which I think only 16 of them were used in more than one study, so huge amount of diversity. But having said that, the 2 most common measures were the youth self-report and the child behaviour checklist, which were both scales developed by Achenbach, who's like the godfather of internalizing and externalizing. Okay, now this is a really big slide, so we're going to be here for a little bit. Get comfy. So in terms of risk factors, so from the 130 variables that were examined, we're able to distill it down to this sort of like smaller number of replicated findings. So this table on screen is just summarizing the replicated findings in relation to general psychopathology, internalizing and externalizing. So the other outcome variables really weren't assessed or common enough to sort of make the cut to be on this table. And the diagram that you see on screen is just a visual representation of risk factors. The thickness of the lines relates to how consistent or how replicated the association is. So obviously executive functioning deficits and neuroticism emerge as particularly well replicated risk factors. In terms of biological variables, so we see that general psychopathology is at least partly genetic. In particular, we saw genetic polygenic risk scores for ADHD and schizophrenia being particularly associated with general psychopathology. We're not sure of how these might relate to specific factors because those studies didn't look at specific factors, unfortunately. We also saw some weird sort of a little bit of messy sort of findings in relation to being female or being male, but sort of in general, we saw that being male was associated with high levels of general psychopathology and externalizing, whereas being female was associated with greater levels of internalizing. Though, yeah, there are some weird inconsistent findings in there that probably need to be delved into a little bit deeper in future research. In terms of socio-environmental variables, stressful life events were associated with general psychopathology and externalizing, but that relationship was a little bit less consistent with internalizing, which was sort of similar to what we saw across childhood trauma and stress type of variables. However, a lot of those variables, they were only looked at in like one study, so they didn't make the cut for this table. And we also saw that maternal depression, of course, was related to general psychopathology and internalizing. In terms of psychological, I first actually want to point out the very bottom row, so openness, which is from the 5-factor model of personality. It was consistently not associated with any form of psychopathology. But in terms of actual risk factors, so we see that things like high negative affectivity was particularly important, as well as neuroticism, behavioural inhibition, low effort for control. All of those were quite strongly associated with general psychopathology and had like varying degrees of association with internalizing or externalizing. In terms of protective factors, there actually wasn't a lot of research on protective factors, and certainly wasn't really any findings that were replicated. I think the sort of the more, the ones that kind of emerged as having associations were collective efficacy, which is a measure of environment reflecting a neighbourhood broadly characterised by things like social cohesion and shared values among neighbours, and a willingness to improve safety and order in a community. And so that was found to be associated with general psychopathology, but it was also found to moderate the effects of things like stressful life events and racial discrimination, and the effects of those on general psychopathology and externalizing. So that collective efficacy is potentially quite an important protective factor in this case. And we also saw parental warmth showing promise, and positive family environment wasn't related to anything. So obviously some more research is needed on protective factors and potentially as well socio-environmental factors in general. So just to summarise, a lot of those replicated findings, there was some kind of association with general psychopathology that was fairly consistent. There were varying associations with specific forms of psychopathology. We saw that general psychopathology is at least partly genetic. We also saw that behavioural inhibition and negative affectivity consistently related to internalizing, but not necessarily externalizing. So broadly, risk factors relating to concepts of self-regulation and emotion regulation were particularly well supported. And as I just mentioned, collective efficacy and parental warmth were quite promising protective factors. In terms of future directions and recommendations, more research is absolutely needed in terms of protective factors, and it would also be good to start seeing research start to focus on mechanisms and processes of risk. So from the present review, things like neuroticism, negative affectivity, effort for control, and executive functioning are all potential targets for further research, and would be particularly helpful to study longitudinally. And there's also a need for more multidisciplinary research and causally driven research methods. And the other main takeaway sort of relates to methodological issues identified. So as you can remember, there was an overwhelming amount of models used, and having said that, it's probably important, while the field hasn't yet sort of arrived on an agreed upon sort of like statistical method for studying dimensions of psychopathology, it's probably really important that future research continue to examine and report findings from multiple models. That will help the field sort of build a consensus on a particular method. And it will probably also help us to understand and resolve some of the inconsistent findings across models. And also there was a lack of any kind of study on some other alternative plausible models. For example, network models were not found at all in this present review, or even like the hybrid latent variable network models. So there's lots of room for future research, which I look forward to contributing to as part of the next phases of my research and my PhD. But that's kind of about all I want to talk about to you guys today. So I just want to say a quick thank you to my supervisors, Kath, Nikki, and Matt, and also a shout out to parents for supporting my research with a PhD scholarship.